In 1944, during World War II, a weapon the world had never seen before emerged: a flying bomb. That morning, the deep and deafening buzz of this weapon, launched toward London, could be heard from miles away. People weren't even aware of what it was. The uncertainty scared them. But when the bomb fell, they realized the power of it. This was the world's first operational cruise missile, Hitler's weapon that struck fear into the world, and his rocket. How did this weapon, which was the nightmare of the British, come about? What was its impact in World War I? The story goes back to the early 1900s. At the beginning of the 1900s, Russian engineer Karavodin was working on a pulse jet engine, also known as the pulse jet. This was a type of jet engine where combustion occurred in pulses. The reason it was called pulse was because the valves in the fuel section would open and close, causing the fuel to suddenly want to exit. Here's an amateur example of this. When the fuel was ignited and reached a level close to explosion, an incredible amount of heat and pressure was generated. The valves open, the pressure escapes through the pipes, and thus thrust is generated. Here you can see the simplest form of this. The description of this series was commissioned by Turkish Radio and Television Corporation to the Audio Description Association. Aside from burning some trees and setting the area ablaze, he succeeded. However, Paul Schmidt pioneered a more efficient design based on the modification of intake valves and gained the support of the German Air Ministry in 1933. In the same year, Nazi Party leader Hitler becomes the new leader of Germany. Despite the limited budget allocated to the project, steady progress is made over the years. In 1934, the work becomes more serious, and the idea emerges that this could be turned into a flying bomb. In 1937, a test site is built in Peenemünde in northern Germany. A new technology was also being tested here, chosen for its secrecy and suitability for the tests. Within a few years, the facility had turned into a factory where 12,000 people worked. While the work was ongoing, Hitler attacked Poland in 1939 and started World War II. Hitler was achieving consecutive victories and was practically reaping the rewards of his extensive preparations. After Hitler captured France within a week following Poland, he thought that Germany was an invincible armada and that the war would end quickly. Therefore, he decided to cut the budget allocated for experimental studies. Hitler's arrogance led to his downfall. The work advanced but produced no results. In 1939, they got tired of Paul Schmidt's slow progress and included Fritz Güsslau in the project. Güsslau was working on remotely controlled airplanes in Berlin. Güsslau, who was an engineer, wanted to make airplanes that could fly unmanned. The Germans, who had little hope left for Schmidt, moved Gustavo's pilotless airplane project from Berlin to the PNM facility. Warplanes were costly and time-consuming to manufacture. Furthermore, skilled pilots were being lost in the war. Gustavo, on the other hand, aimed to design a cheaper and quickly built pilotless aircraft that could drop bombs, be brought back by remote control, and be reloaded with bombs. Meanwhile, as Hitler had expected, the war did not end quickly. In fact, in 1942, the German city of Lübeck was bombed by the British. The defending Allies had started to retaliate. The bombers that Hitler relied on had not caused enough destruction for England. After that, although he wasn't very hopeful, he started to focus more on experimental studies. The first drafts of the pilotless aircraft were made in the spring of 1942. The pulse jet engine containing an explosive was positioned at the aircraft's center. Months later, the first test flights were carried out. These rockets, called flying bombs, were also known as FGSTU-MMAF-1 or V-1. In English, it means revenge weapon. The V-1 rockets were pilotless jet planes and were the ancestors of today's cruise missiles. The V-1, which was about 8 meters long and equipped with a small jet engine, could fly at an altitude of 800,000 meters at a speed of 500 kilometers per hour with the help of a primitive autopilot placed inside, and could carry its warhead containing nearly 2 tons of explosives up to 250 kilometers away. Here's how its operating system worked. The V-1 rocket used both fuel and air at the same time to generate thrust. Fuel was injected into the 8-meter-long nose, and when it mixed with air, it was ignited. This created a rapid thrust force until the fuel ran out. An internal timer on it was set before launch. After launch, the B-1 would fly until the timer reached 0, then begin its descent. While tests were still ongoing at PNM, a very undesirable incident occurred. British spy planes had secretly photographed the area and identified some facilities whose purpose was unknown. In this aerial photograph, the locations to be raided were marked. On a night in August 1943, the facility in Peenemünde was bombed by the British with hundreds of bombs. The facility was heavily damaged, but the scientists were still alive. The Germans moved the facility to a safer place, an iron mine in Deir-Selek. They built a massive facility here. Thousands of prisoners from concentration camps were transferred to this facility. Most of the people working in this cold and damp place without seeing the sun would lose their lives due to the working conditions. At the end of 1943, V-1 rockets went into mass production. About 5,000 units were produced. The launch ramps were positioned at many points in northern France, the region closest to England. When the British scanned the area from the air and took photographs, they noticed something strange. On one of the ramps, they saw an interesting aircraft pointed towards London. This was the second major mistake made by the German army. It was as if they were amateurs, and clearly they hadn't learned any lessons from the first bombing. The British dropped more than 120 tons of bombs on the V-1 missile sites on the French coast captured by the Germans, without the Germans even knowing about it. They rendered most of the V-1 launch ramps unusable, but they still hadn't figured out what these were. The Germans built dozens more V-1 sites within weeks, but this time they hid them inside the forest. They were more careful now. These square-shaped concrete blocks you see formed the base of the launch ramps. This is what the ramp looked like. When the start was given, a V-1 rocket standing on the ramp would suddenly accelerate and take off using the catapult system. The goal was to launch the rockets, which were aimed at England and had their timer set toward the city so that they would fall there and cause destruction in the city. In June, 1,944 V-1 aircraft were moved to concealed ramps. Everything was ready now. This time the British hadn't noticed. The Germans launched the V-1 rocket one after another. In the early hours of the morning, people who were unaware of everything witnessed a strange object roaming the skies over London. A plane-like object, with flames coming out of its back and making a sound like a broken motorcycle from afar, was flying overhead. A few minutes later, all the sounds had stopped. This strange thing on the hill, which they first noticed, had started to fall. And then the warhead, weighing about 2 tons, hit the edge of the railway bridge and exploded, causing the death of 6 people. Of the first 10 Weber rockets launched, only 4 landed on British soil and only 1 reached the city. That single rocket rendered dozens of houses in the area unusable. In this photo, you can see the effects of the destruction. Many buildings within the area are in ruins.
The blast of the flying bombs and rockets exceeded anything London experienced in the earlier Blitz. Day and night, men, women, and children were being killed and maimed. Hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed or damaged. By September, almost 1 million required repairs.
In this photo taken right after the incident, you see an old man and his dog. The old man, who went for a walk with his dog while his wife was preparing breakfast on Sunday, learned that his house had collapsed and his wife was trapped under the rubble when he returned. This was just one of the painful memories brought by this war. For the first time in the history of world wars, one country dropped a bomb on another country without taking any risks and caused serious damage. This technology had frightened even distant America, but it wasn't the destruction Hitler dreamed of. After the first launch, the Germans made more precise calculations and launched 244 more missiles within a few days. This time, more than 70 missiles had fallen on England. This was frightening and had created a deterrent effect. When the V-1S took off, they flew with a distinctive sound. When the engine stopped, that's when the danger began. The British had called the V-1 rockets the flying bomb or the buzz bomb. The V-1 rockets caused terrible days for the British, but they weren't very effective in changing the course of the war. Sure, they were cheaper and easier to make, but since the V-1S flew in a straight line and made a lot of noise, a significant number of them were easily detected by the Allies. And since they weren't very fast, they were shot down by British fighter planes before reaching their targets. What really rendered the V-1S ineffective was the advance of the Allies. With the Normandy landings, the Germans faced an unexpected response. The French coasts from which the 5 V-1S were launched were captured and many of them were destroyed. The V-1 project was now being shelved because the war was going badly for the Germans. They couldn't devote any more time to it. Although Weber had his downsides, the United States military was very interested in it. America, which was inexperienced in radio-controlled flying bombs like the BQ weapons, seized the structure and components of the German-made Weber and sent them to Wright-Patterson Field in Ohio for evaluation. Within 3 weeks, the German industry would build their own Weber, called Jet Bump 2, and more informally known as Thunderbird. For now, the Germans had given up on the V-1, but they had another project that they were secretly working on. The Allies, who thought they had gotten rid of the newly encountered V-1, were facing a completely different danger. This new weapon would change the fate of the world and in the future start a new war between America and Russia.